humans are amazing and they do amazing things, but they're not scalable on their own.
You work with so many nonprofits. Like, what do you think? What's the biggest thing that they're misunderstanding?
There's just not, I think, the realization that this is a tectonic shift in not just technology, but in how work gets done. And at the balance of that is, human lives.
Okay, I could do this the way I've been doing it for the last 15 years, or I could spend an entire day figuring out how to build a new system for this.
The people that are not using AI right now, it's on them. If you want to know, how can I use AI to help me with my job? Just ask it. There's no excuse. You don't need an expert for that. 2,300 years later, we actually, for the first time in human history, have the ability to solve for something that Aristotle said was impossible. So that's super cool.
Hey everyone, and thanks for tuning in to another episode of The Chief AI Officer. Today, I'm talking to Nathan Chappell from Virtuous. Nathan, thanks so much for joining with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ben. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, we were just catching up before we started recording about, a little bit why you joined Virtuous and your career journey. But for our audience, can you give them a brief background into, who is Nathan and how did you end up as CAIO at Virtuous?
Yeah, well, I'll try to condense it as quick as possible. I am a technologist turned accidental fundraiser, turned back to technology, kind of bookend my 20-year stint in nonprofit fundraising and leading nonprofits, and then got completely enamored with AI/ML in 2017, launched a couple initiatives and companies, and then essentially followed Virtuous for a number of years and what they stood for as a company that's trying to increase net generosity by $10 billion, and kind of fell in love with that ethos, and then was invited in to serve as their first chief AI officer back in May. And so it's been amazing trying to figure out what the job is and isn't and all those things, as probably most CIOs are doing right now, because AI just has become completely, just so diffused among all activities within an organization, it becomes a bit unwieldy.
Yeah, I think it's a role and function that has been growing a lot over the last few years. Blend of CTO, a lot of business side, as you said, it's kind of everywhere in the organization. You mentioned one thing, what sparked that interest in 2017 for you?
It actually came I actually wrote my first book called The Generosity Crisis, which kind of chronicles the decline in civic participation. So less people donating to nonprofits, less people donating blood, less people participating in PTAs or, bowling leagues. It's just ongoing, the systemic decline in civic participation. So in 2017, while we were raising more money because we were just basically throwing more money to raise more money, I knew it wasn't a sustainable strategy. And our CEO of a cancer hospital came to us and he just gave us this grand challenge. And it's like one of those challenges that makes you rethink everything you think you know. And he basically, and I think this is just a typical CEO thing to do. It's like, you need to, increase revenue by 25%. And then before he walked out the door, he said, oh, by the way, you can't hire any new people. And so 2017, that was a moment where I was like, I'm really grateful for that goal, even though it seemed, audacious at the time, was that it just made us rethink everything. Humans are amazing and they do amazing things, but they're not scalable on their own. And so I started looking, being in the nonprofit sector, I was looking at the private sector and how orgs, obviously from Google's and all of those, the big tech companies, but in addition to Nike and Samsung and AT&T and how they were really transforming how they were looking at what a customer was in real time using a lot of deep AI/ML, and became, super interested in that. Spent a year and a half building our first model where we actually, even that crude model outperformed any of our previous techniques by about 5x. And so that was okay, we're onto something here.
Yeah, it's funny. I think what we see with a lot of companies is this long-standing kind of commitment to ML for driving a ton of business value for a long time, right? Whether that's in churn analysis, CRM stuff, or whether it's really
business
process, efficiency, data mining. What we're seeing much more recently is a lot more the turn towards LLMs,
right.
And the different ways that those can be applied. And I'm sure we'll get into a ton of that today. But you said something about generosity being humanity's greatest technology before in the past. I think it was potentially part of your book too. what inspired you to make a statement like that, and has your vision for philanthropy changed? You mentioned civic participation, the decline of that. We see that a lot, in modern societies, particularly I think in the US. I'm completely blanking on the name, but is it Robert Putnam
Yeah,
in the
Putnam,
US?
Bowling Alone. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. That's that it kind of, your statement brought that to mind. To me, yeah, give me a little bit more background on that. What is the role of generosity for you in the modern world?
Yeah, the reality is obviously generosity is not a technology in the sense of something that you plug in or, runs off code, but societies are based on it. Societies in from pretty much the beginning of civilization have been based on some forms of generosity, whether formal or informal. Essentially humans are these pro-social creatures that we tend to care for others in our species, even if there's a detriment to ourselves. And not all animal species do this, but others do. And so, when I thought about, the greatest threat to humanity, it's not a decline in participation. It's truly whether people care or not. My grandfather wrote a book. He was a geologist in 1971, wrote a book called Crisis by Consent. It's on my shelf up there. And it was really what happens if people stop caring. And, that's the thing that wakes me up at night. So while Putnam's work is evidenced in the last 40 years that people tend to be a bit more socially isolated and atomized from that perspective, AI happens to be this one technology in spite of all those things, this one technology that has tremendous power to actually reverse those trends. So, I think toward the end of my first book, you came to the conclusion, while it wasn't a book about AI, it came to the conclusion that AI is the only scalable solution to reversing the generosity crisis, because humans are amazing and can do amazing things, but again, we're not scalable. And all of a sudden, despite all those headwinds, but despite all the challenges that our societies are facing, we actually have the ability to rethink and try new things that we haven't before, And at the end, and we can obviously go lots of directions on this, at the end, if there's a lot of good people out there enabled by, empowered by technology that can amplify intention, that can be used for a tremendous net positive. And so, this becomes a different debate on, do you believe, people are inherently good or bad? And that probably is reserved for another podcast.
Yeah, it's funny you touch on so many things there that come to mind, as like that intention, right? Because I think in AI, in a lot of people's minds, the AI can be used for so many disturbing things as well, right? I have a lot of people come on this podcast when you talk about what are their fears around AI. There's a lot of misinformation, deepfakes come up a lot. There is like all of this stuff around just almost like further atomization of what you from other
Right.
people and what it means to be human. There's something very alienating about seeing a machine interact in such what feels like a human way, and doing work that we long thought was reserved for humans. But you seem to have a very positive vision for that. And you're having also this, working in a space that also is hopefully relying on the best parts of human nature and that desire to be virtuous or generous. Can you, what are some of the challenges that you're seeing, like as you wrestle with all of those things?
Yeah, I think most people have kind of those two different, hats. My 9 to 5 or, probably 6 a.m. to 5 job is really about scaling generosity with AI. And so I have to believe, I literally, unless I wake up lying to myself every day, I have to truly believe that AI is a mission amplifier, that it can actually absolutely amplify good intention. But then there's the campfire conversation, and my neighbor, who's in AI and has been for a long time, he's, he's a bit of a conspiracy theorist like I am with some things. And it's not what you see, it's what you don't see that makes you wonder, like what's going on here? There's a lot of that. I think I had to reconcile with this a couple of years ago, which was like, even inevitably, if I'm wrong and, the net negative outweighs the net positive, at least I am true to my own values as an individual and work at an organization. So Virtuous is grounded not by just selling more products. It's actually grounded by increasing net generosity by $10 billion. So at least like by every ounce of my effort to my dying day, I'll fight for that side, even if it might be inevitable that, I mean, it's inevitable bad things will happen. It's just what the balance of those bad to good things will be. And I think that's the emerging role, in my opinion, of a chief AI officer is not as much on the technical side anymore, as much more about the conscience of the organization. Because now AI is among in and through everything within the organization, everything it does. You can't, it's like when it was AI ML, I'd be like, oh, well, I can oversee our AML practice and make sure that humans are in the loop. Now we have got everybody using everything. And at a certain point, my role then is like understanding kind of in gross terms, like what's happening, and then serve as that conscience of the organization. And it really makes sure that we have AI governance and acceptable use, but also, guardrails around, times when it's okay to say no.
Mm-hmm. And so I think that term just in itself, conscious approach, right, feels like it goes a step further than just governance and guardrails, right? There's something very mission driven about using a term like that. What is that for you? Can you unpack it a little bit?
Yeah, and this is where probably, even though Virtuous is a for-profit company, but we only work with nonprofits. When I started working with AML within a nonprofit in like 2017, our first model actually that did very well, we were like, whoa, there's something here. And we also knew the tremendous potential for bias. And, essentially these declines that we were just talking about would be amplified 100x if we just decide to use AI to manipulate people to make gifts to nonprofits or lie to people to tell them we're doing things we're not. And so, at its core, the nonprofit sector is a public benefit company that exists by and for the public. It operates, instead of products and services, it operates in the currency of trust. So, you could be an untrustworthy AI company and have really great products or services, and people are willing to kind of put some of the bad, and I don't have to name names, but you could think of your favorite person that you like to hate within the the private sector, and whatever leader, pick whichever one you really don't like. And at the end of the day, like, you probably still use their products and services because they're really good, right? And so in the nonprofit sector doesn't have products and services to back up from. They operate in this currency of trust. And so for me, Anthropic uses trustworthy AI. We started using not just responsible AI, but we follow the guys that has to be responsible and beneficial. And the difference there is, responsible is, of course, private and ethical and all those things that would be in a typical like responsible AI framework. Beneficial means that we also need to look at something in the long term. We can't only, if we operate in the currency of trust, we can't only allow AI to benefit us in the short term. We have to work hard to identify and mitigate potential harm in the long term. So I think that's the key difference. And in a lot of ways, because the nonprofit sector is not incentivized monetarily the same way as the private sector, it allows the nonprofit sector to be actually like this voice of reason. It's like this inherent superpower that the nonprofit sector has, be like, hey, wait a minute, if you didn't have those financial incentives to scale, over, and scale massively over, making safe AI, it would look kind of like what the nonprofit sector is doing. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. So I don't know. I love being on this side. And even though nonprofits are usually so behind in adopting technology, this is an area actually I think they're really ahead with, and how the private sector should look and follow that example.
And in part, I guess you're saying that it's that ability to not be chasing their short-term profit all the time. It's that longer time horizon that a nonprofit sector company can take that enables that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and there's plenty of examples of things that we can do, but we shouldn't do. I mean, whether it's like eating Twinkies, for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or it's, social media, that the classic social media, or use the environment, whatever you want. But like social media was intended to essentially, bring people together. I mean, it was built to make people money, but it was built to bring people together. But obviously overuse of that technology has had lots of unintended consequences. And so, the nonprofit sector can look at things more objectively, just because it doesn't have the same financial incentives to scale at any cost. We can scale, but we can scale in a way that truly aligns with our values. And that's Not that it's unheard of in the private sector. It's just not as common because, I think with Jeffrey Hinton, I was in Geneva like 2 years ago, and he was saying that, for every 1,000 papers that are written on AI scale, only one paper is written on safety. And we shouldn't be surprised by that, right? Because capital markets will always incentivize scale over safety. But the nonprofit sector, because it's on the opposite side of the coin, it's actually very freeing, and we're seeing a few glimpses of this in other areas. But it's kind of nice to be on that side of the equation at this point in history.
Yeah, I'm sure it gives you an insight also into, you know, how you can really drive change in that sector as these organizations are trying to implement AI, or you work with so many nonprofits. Like, what do you think? What's the biggest thing that they're misunderstanding? Right? It seems like they get that longer time horizon ability to not focus on scale, right? But what are some things where they might stumble a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard. I mean, AI adoption in the nonprofit sector is high in the sense of the average person is like, coming to work with their shadow AI, and they're, using it to like, proof an email or something. But it's really low on the strategic deployment of AI to like actually scale mission or impact. And so what I think they're failing to understand, one is, this technology, the scale of the technology, I mean, true from like an exponential perspective, is just trying to categorize it as, oh, it's kind of like the internet. And it is in some ways, in that it's in and through everything, but it's completely unlike the internet because the internet still operates in the same TCP/IP protocol that it did in 1994. AI, like we're talking about agentic and generative, that were terms like Microsoft Word still thinks agentic's a typo. So we're talking about technology that adapts and changes really quickly. And I think the sector, because they've been slow to adopt and they kind of operate in this scarcity mindset a bit, there's just not, I think, the realization that this is, I mean, a tectonic shift in not just technology, but in how work gets done. And at the balance of that is, human lives. So, I look at it, the deployment of AI or adoption of AI in the nonprofit sector as a moral imperative, not as a technological advancement. And so I think a lot of leaders are just really failing to see the gravity of that conversation.
And you see it as a moral and imperative because it enables the kind of fulfillment of the fundamental mission, like much more in a much more accelerated way. And so it would be almost irresponsible to not drive towards that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I
Yeah.
think it was like in 97, 98. I was like, think about a future where, or even at that time, if you just told your constituency, you're like, look, we're not going to use the internet anymore because like there's cyberbullying and like this one kid learned how to build a pipe bomb and whatever. And, how irresponsible would that be? And people thought I had like four heads when I was talking about this. And I was equating it to like, there'll be a future where not using AI will seem, I mean, like absurd, completely absurd. And it absolutely should be at this point. It should be absurd to think about, I often tell people, if you have a best practice that predates November 30th, 2022, so the date ChatGPT came out, then it's an outdated practice. So really like questioning like how many of your quote unquote best practices, predate that, or how many of your best practices look, the same as they did 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So the moral imperative part is that now we have a technology that knows something about everything and can seemingly do anything. The moral imperative is actually to use it. Like how archaic would be like, oh, let's just go do things the same way we were doing them 10 years ago and hope for the best. I mean, that's just wholly irresponsible in my opinion.
Yeah. It's an interesting one too, where there's a need to accept that. And then the ability to embrace it also relies on understanding the deep limitations of the technology and where that intelligence is very jagged versus just like a perfect kind of application of it in any domain. But it is very interesting to see how that's evolved. I think the smaller organizations, the ones that a lot of people are trying to learn from right now, are the ones where people are defaulting to AI in everything that they're doing. And
Right.
that's kind of like the mindset in which they operate. You see that shift with younger people too, right? That are like growing up with GPT or any other model you can name, that kind of default to like, okay, how can I solve this? Like, I know in my own work, it's always, okay, I could do this the way I've been doing it for the last 15 years, or I could spend an entire day figuring out how to like build a new system for this. And it's going to take me a lot more time to begin with, but then the payoff is so huge in terms of just iterate, like repeatedly doing that task, that it is almost always worth the upfront investment. But I think it does take a very significant
Mhm.
mindset shift that is hard to get around for some people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's starting with several years ago doing quote unquote AI training, where it was like, oh, here's the technical. I mean, it started out with like technical terms like precision and recall and all the things that we had to cut our teeth on before AI was cool. And then when generative came out, it was like, oh, here's how to write a good prompt, and here's all these different things, and even that seemed a little overwhelming. I actually no longer do really any AI training. I'm kind of like, look, like the people that are not using AI right now, like it's on them. Like if you want to know like how can I use AI to help me with my job, just ask it. There's no excuse. You don't need an expert for that. So I approach almost every conversation now from a state to your point of like, increasing your curiosity quotient, because if you as a individual are curious and you're a curious generalist, then you're going to thrive. As an organization, if you don't have an appetite for curiosity or incentivize questions more than answers, you're just not going to go as far, definitely not as fast as quote unquote your competitors. And so I think I only say quote unquote competitors because the nonprofit sector doesn't like to use the word competitor, but there are people vying for, to scale impact in different ways. And so I think the organizations that build this inherently curious culture don't have to be technical experts, but they're going to thrive because they'll approach it from a new mindset of like anything is possible. And the reality is, you and I both know it's like if it's not possible today, all you have to do is wait 2 months and then it probably will be. And so, just to incentivize that curiosity throughout your organization, but it completely changes who you hire and how you promote. I mean, I used to hire the subject matter expert that had like 15 years domain experience in one thing and they're really good. I mean, sadly, like I don't want that person anymore. I want the scrappy person who's like just the curious generalist that knows how to connect dots. I mean, that's like the ideal candidate in this age.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more as far as like how you look for the right hire, particularly in smaller companies where you can be much more agile and you want that person that's just going to get their hands dirty and think from that
Absolutely.
curiosity mindset. Is that the method that you think has worked best in terms of getting leaders within the nonprofit space to think about and kind of embrace AI or hire the right people into their organization?
Yeah, I think actually for leaders and for non-leaders. So, from just an actual just professional perspective, it's like, oh, I don't have the technical experience. I don't want to go back to school. I don't want to learn something new. So, I approach almost everything from the state of curiosity on the individual level because every person is born inherently curious. Like as children, we only become less curious over time because societies and social norms and all the things mold us into how curious we are, right? Our parents actually like play a formative role in helping us either be or more or less curious based on like this is right and this is wrong, like coloring outside the lines, all those things. And I think so I do that with individuals a lot, but then with leaders, in that safe space, understanding that, I used to be this leader who'd be like, I used to use the term a lot, like keep your eyes on your paper. Like I'd hire an expert, pay him a lot of money and be like, if you are going to succeed if you keep your eyes on your paper and you just focus on your thing and you're going to go there. That's what's better for you. It's better for everybody. That's what we need. We have to deprogram like how leaders have led for a long time by absolutely, flipping that script. And I do think this is a big distinction. The private sector tends to reward, R&D. I mean, there's very, very few nonprofits that have R&D funds, period, because of how nonprofits are evaluated. So, but I was with, one nonprofit leader who is not a technologist. She started creating failure days. And it was like this radical concept where people would be like, try stuff and then come back, on the first Friday of every month. And we're going to talk about things that didn't work because she knew inherently that when people talked about what didn't work, either somebody else would be like, oh, I tried that too, but then there's another way. Or the person's like, oh, I tried that and it didn't work. So I tried it a different way on my own. And so, just incentivizing that I think is a big, big shift. And we have to deprogram like literally decades of single domain expertise work and flip that script completely upside down.
Yeah, it's a very hard thing to deprogram when your entire educational culture is built around specialization.
Right.
And even your, like on everything in business. But I agree, it's the people that have those skills that are proving to be the most effective and the most willing to rethink and just completely change how the work gets done.
Yeah.
And with a healthy dose of skepticism about what the technology is good at and what it's bad at, I think you can go very, very far. What is the kind of the biggest objection that you're typically hearing from nonprofit leaders as they think about implementing AI, and how do you address it?
It's been waves. I don't know for you. Like, so when I think about like kind of thematically from a like a meta perspective, like originally it started out with bias. Like bias and ethics were like the thing that everyone done. Probably before that it was security. So security, bias, ethics. And then it moved into, because we kind of got through those, and actually AIML became actually very transparent, and we were able to like show how decisions were being made, and overcame a lot of those. And so there's just been like these waves of kind of quote unquote excuses for not to engage. I think now we see the most in the nonprofit sector around the environment, and environmental impact, because as a nonprofit you can't be like, well, I have this inherent struggle of like, well, how can I do good for my mission, even if it's like a youth service organization or whatever, and at the same time know that I'm doing harm to the environment. And so, we just constantly having to, overcome some of these objections, like in kind of like from meta terms. And at a certain point, that's why, again, I think those that aren't going to use AI are just not going to at this point. And the reality is the market will take care of them. Like the market, like the digital divide will be the digital chasm. And those that use AI will outperform those that don't. And therefore, the ones that don't will probably go have to find different jobs that, are not, probably it'd be hard to find a job that actually is not highly influenced by AI anymore. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think that, adoption also, I think really is still not, it's not adoption's high, it's just the strategic implementation. Like I was with a leader who, 100-year-old organization, created their first 5-year strategic plan. And I was like, and they came up and they're like, oh, we developed this 5-year strategic plan. It's like, very, very large organization. I mean, like $1 billion a year in revenue. And I was like, high five, like chief strategy officer, way to go. Like at what point did you stop and evaluate that based on how AI could either ensure your chance of success, to increase the chance of success, or perhaps even make 5 years, 3 years? And there was just like this look on the face of like, oh, we didn't do that. And at the end of the day, I think it's the biggest risk to adoption is just thinking in older ways, like in older terms and how you used to do things. And then again, expecting a different result. So it has, again, way more to do with mindset than it does with technical ability.
Yeah, it's funny. As you were saying that, it reminded me of a conversation I had with someone else on the podcast, where they were talking about the implementation of knowledge graphs and how they felt that that was like a really key component for organizations to get value out of AI, was building their own ontologies of like their understanding, like codifying their understanding of the world in order to really like get the most out of AI. And he said something that made me laugh, which reminds me of that, because you said they never run a 5-year plan before, is that a lot of organizations don't even know themselves, right? They don't really understand like what their differentiated value is, like how they should be operating from a strategic point of view. And so, but if they had that, they're like, if they really are able to codify that and make that context that they then feed into a model, for example, then you're off to the races. But like, it's very hard to get people out of the mindset of we're just going to do this because we've been doing it this way for hundreds of years.
Right. And it quote unquote worked. And, and I'd argue that it won't work in the future. And the reality is that work is so much easier now. I mean, you can have expert level guidance in helping you identify, getting down to the, the core values of what you're looking for. The other piece, obviously, and I'm sure you see this a lot, I don't know how much in the private sector, but, organizations they're starting with like, oh, we just need to use AI. So those that are just like, oh, we need to use AI. And then they ask, what's AI? And they're just trying to throw AI into everything they do. And there's that study that just came out from MIT a couple of weeks ago that says 95% of those that are using AI fail. The 5% that actually succeeded were the ones that were narrow, right? They were like very specific and intentional in what they were trying to do. And so To be honest, like starting with AI governance it's not very sexy, but it's so important because you're looking at holistically what are our values, what are we trying to achieve, what is our stance on the use of AI to align with our values, and then move from there to acceptable use, and then at least you're like, okay, like now I at least understand at a basis like what's our belief system around this type of technology for what we do. And then I could be more comfortable safeguarding trust, with our stakeholders and moving into the form of AI that's appropriate. So yeah, it seems hard, but it's actually not. Like that's some of the easiest stuff to do, but so few organizations actually take the time to do that.
Yeah. And is your experience of the implementation in the nonprofit space very much reflect that MIT study, which is that, the narrow use cases are the ones that are driving the most value?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in all reality, like especially so in nonprofits, there's a saying that, no money, no mission. And so people ask me like, well, why did you start? So I've been working in nonprofits for a long time, and application of AI to like solve humanity's greatest issues, absolutely there, like all of them. But if they don't have the money to actually do those things, then they'll never get there. And so I started focusing on fundraising. And in all reality, like we see there's just so much inefficiency in the sense of like, it doesn't matter how much you ask somebody for, or when you ask, or in what way you ask, and whatever. None of it matters unless it's the right person to begin with. And so using machine learning to quantify connection and then measuring that continuously, that actually gave us, I mean, Aristotle talked about that 2,300 years ago, specifically about philanthropy. And it like the quote was basically the idea of giving away money is easy, but to decide who to give it to, when, and for what purpose and what way is really hard. So like I become so bullish on this idea that 2,300 years later, we actually, for the first time in human history, have the ability to solve for something that Aristotle said was impossible. So like that's super cool. It took us 2,300 years to get there. And now it's like incumbent upon us to actually do those things. And so, yeah, I don't know. I get like still like so like pumped up about this because I think now both the confluence of predictive and generative, and then of course agentic, come together at this moment when people are more socially isolated. They're not leaning in, and we have the tools now to be able to for every person, I believe, I mean, we're wired, our human brains are wired to be pro-social. So now we have technology that can actually find and prioritize and provide opportunities for people to fulfill their biological need to be generous. And again, it sounds strong to say moral imperative, but it becomes something that like, look, we can solve the world's unsolvable problems if we're willing to get out of our way and actually rethink a lot of things.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's a very, as I said at the beginning of this conversation, a very positive vision for what the technology can bring. So I'd love to kind of end on that note with the positivity hanging in the air. But before
Perfect.
that, in terms of a lightning round, I'd love to just understand, like what's the AI tool that you personally use the most in your daily work?
It's so cliche, probably. The one I use the most before my first cup of coffee is chat. I use Pro. I have 3 different chat accounts for different things, but I mean, it's just for all my writing, it's so helpful for thought and curiosity. But I use Perplexity. I also use Claude quite a bit. Actually, Claude's continuing to grow in my favor. And then NAN is an awesome tool. I don't know, just from a agentic perspective, it's just like so cool to set up automations that just are serving information to you like really quickly.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm a big fan of. I use all of those as well, so I can definitely relate there. And do you have a go-to resource that you would recommend for our audience to stay up to date on AI or the nonprofit space specifically?
Well, not the nonprofit space. So I have a podcast called Fundraising AI that I do every couple weeks, and it was mainly because there wasn't one. So there's a few attempts, but there's just not a lot of application from the private sector to the nonprofit sector. And so, the people that I follow closely are like Mustafa Solomon, who I think has just a really good perspective on like where the future is going. So, and then Ali K. Miller, I think those two are a good balance, and Ethan Mollick probably I reference a lot. So,
Yeah, I know all good follows,
yeah,
so I'd
yeah.
recommend our audience to follow them. And what is a phrase or idea about AI and generosity that recently stuck with you?
I found this quote recently, and it basically says that the world is not unimaginative or ungenerous. It's just they're very busy. So, and when I looked at this quote, I found it was written in 1927 by the founder of Save the Children, and by a woman named Eglantine Jebb. And so, like the idea of like people aren't unimaginative, they're just really busy. And then I reflected on the pace of information in 1927. I think information was doubling about every 100 years, and then in the 50s it was every 25 years, and then now it's said that information doubles every 12 hours. And so when I think about the age of AI and the information explosion and AI 2027, information most likely will double every few hours. And so, like, if that was true in 1927, people aren't ungenerous, they're just very busy. What does that mean today? It's like we have to so it's really stuck with me. And I'm like, we have to really dig deep and think hard about, the future of humanity kind of rests on our ability to get this right. Otherwise, like, I mean, there's going to be no hope. Like, we're not in the business of raising money for nonprofits. We're in the business of connecting with people. And so we need to use AI as a force amplifier to actually connect.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great message to end on. Nathan, I love this conversation. If people want to follow your work, you mentioned Fundraising AI, your podcast, but is there anywhere else they should go to follow your work?
Yeah, in fact, everything's kind of consolidated on my personal website, nathanchappell.com, nathanchappell.com. And in fact, there are two audio versions, so Notebook LM audio versions of each of my books on that website. So you don't even have to read it. You just listen to an 18-minute podcast of it. But yeah, and I love LinkedIn. I write a lot about kind of this area, the intersection of AI and generosity, quite a bit on LinkedIn. And so people can follow me there and take a look at what's going on.
Great. Well, yeah, for our listeners, that's Nathan Chappell, currently CAIO at Virtuous, also has a podcast, Fundraising AI. So check out his website. Nathan, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ben. This is great.